After receiving John Goshert, after receiving his PhD from Purdue University, John Goshert has been fighting the good fight here at UVU since 2001. He teaches in contemporary critical theory, gay and lesbian literature and culture, and multi-ethnic American culture and contemporary American literature. In addition to this, and being an accomplished teacher at UVU, he is also well published in journals and has a book under his belt about Frank Chen. John is well suited for this panel because of his interest in its music's effect in culture, especially the history of early punk. He has been a friend of the Revolutionary Students Union and has given lectures on critical theory, which drew an exceptional attendance. So let's give him a hand. This is Joe Spencer. Joe Spencer has degrees in philosophy and library science from Brigham Young University and San Jose University. Has spent the past years teaching philosophy here at UVU, but will be pursuing a further graduate work in philosophy beginning this fall at the University of New Mexico. So congratulations already. He has published articles on philosophy and theologies in various journals, and his first book is due out this November from Salt Press. Joe's research interests center primarily around the work of the philosopher Alain Badiou. He has presented a handful of times here at the RSU, and will be speaking today about the aesthetic theory of Jacques Rancière. So let's give these guys a hand. And do you guys have a? All right. Joe says he's easy here, so we'll go with that.
I provided Jacob with that bio before I wrote what I was going to talk about today, so I'm going to talk about Badiou and Rancière. And since you've done research in early punk, I should mention that, and in light of Paul's thing earlier, in high school I was in a punk band called August Spies, so this is doubly appropriate perhaps. So I should begin by coming clean with a confession. My thinking about the revolutionary capacity of art is currently in flux. So the consequence, whether fortunate or unfortunate, is that I'm not sure I have a position of my own to present to you today. But rather I'd like to present what seems to me to be the central problem to be worked out with regard to this question, at least from the parts of the field I'm in. You'll all, I hope, forgive me if what I have to say seems more historical than theoretical. Alain Badiou has argued, and quite productively I believe, that the past 2 centuries can be described as the age of sutures, that is, of periods during which philosophy has, quote, handed over the whole of thought to one generic truth procedure, whether that be to politics, to love, to science, or to art. On its analysis, the 19th century was characterized by 2 such sutures, a political suture in continental Europe and a scientific suture in the Anglo-American world. This double suture, however, effectively collapsed after the first decades of the 20th century when Martin Heidegger proposed a suture of philosophy to art, launching a thinking of being that can only be undertaken most rigorously by thinking with the poets, whether Greek or German. Those are almost the same for Heidegger at that. Setting aside for the moment Badiou's own proposals to desuture philosophy entirely from its conditions, to restore philosophy to its task as the thought of the compossibility of politics, love, science, and art, it's worth recognizing how the story, as Badiou tells it, is effectively culminated in the rise, with explicit reference to Heidegger, of the most persistent groups of thinkers given to the question of politics and aesthetics, namely the Frankfurt School. The Frankfurt School, complexly committed both to Heidegger's privileging of art and to something like the Marxist project that seemed already to be fading as World War II approached, remains the standard starting point for any discussion of the revolutionary capacity of art. But it was ironically these thinkers, or at least the curious appropriation of their political pessimism in post-World War II France, that did more for the sheer dismissal of emancipatory politics, to the point, in fact, that the French emancipatory efforts of the 1960s and 1970s were generally undertaken through a rather vocal rejection of everything the Frankfurt School had set forth. And 2 of those young radicals, both associated early on with Louis Althusser, make up the poles of what seems to me to be the essential question to be asked today. The first of these already mentioned is Alain Badiou. The second, friend of and constant interlocutor with Badiou, is Jacques Rancière. Badiou, as I have already intimated, is called through his Manifesto for Philosophy, a sequel to which is due out in July, so order your copy today, for a desuturing of philosophy from art, a kind of de-Heideggerization of philosophy. As he argues with exhausting rigor in Being an Event, this desuturing is necessary because Heidegger's famous Seinsfrage, the question of being, has been responded to in the wrong way, according to him. It is not art that thinks being, according to Badiou, but set theoretical mathematics, the pure thought of the multiple that does so. The desuturing Badiou calls for, however, is not to be followed by a resuturing of philosophy to mathematics. Rather, Badiou is quite clear that mathematics or science, for him, same thing, like art, is only one of 4 conditions for philosophy. In other words, philosophy is not, for Badiou, the thinking of being, but instead the thinking of the compossibility of several truth procedures, among which both mathematics and art can be found, along with politics and love. Consequence of all this for Badiou is that art is not political. Indeed, that there is no politically emancipatory potential in art. Whatever is revolutionary about a given work of art is solely its capacity to revolutionize art itself. Not to politicize it, but to revolutionize it. It has nothing to propose to political thought or action as such. Schoenberg's fidelity to the Mahler event, carrying the collapse of tonality to its radical conclusion, for example, registers nothing at the level of the political for Badiou. In order to think about the implicit connections between what is happening in art and what is happening in emancipatory politics, Badiou would say that one must strike an explicitly philosophical figure, since all thinking of the compossibility of truth procedures, that's of art and politics together, is philosophical thinking. And so one would only be wagering a thesis about a particular epoch, that of the time in which this kind of art and this political sequence coincide. Of course, Badiou is not at all opposed to doing such philosophical thinking about the compossibility of art and politics. He is, after all, a philosopher. And so he has dedicated several of his publications to precisely this philosophical question, in particular his Handbook of Aesthetics and his astounding analysis entitled The Century, which Zizek says is the book written in the last 3 decades. He takes as his task in the latter, in the century, in particular to sort out philosophically the character of an entire period, the 20th century. But it is in the former, in his Handbook of Aesthetics, that Badiou attempts to make sense of what art as such is capable of. And it is capable of, in a word, artistic truths. But at this point, let me leave Badiou, I hope that's clear enough for the moment, to trace the pathway that has been traveled by Jacques Rancière, particularly because it will be precisely in terms of Badiou's work in the Handbook of Aesthetics that their paths will definitively cross as regards art and politics. Rancière, as I have already mentioned, began his academic career in the circle of Louis Althusser, having even contributed an essay to Le Capital, that book only second in importance to Mao's writings during the student uprising in Paris. Rancière broke, however, with Althusser in the 1970s, publishing La Leçon d'Althusser in order to measure their disagreement, the lesson of Althusser. What followed was a series of publications during the 1980s and 1990s on political history and theory, all of these being set off by subtle, all too easily overlooked questions about aesthetics, just on the margins of his text. Eventually, more or less about the turn of the millennium, Rancière finally began to move his aesthetic questions from the margins of his text to the very center of his writings. The result is that the past decade has seen a constant stream of publications from Rancière dealing with aesthetics and politics in the most direct and forceful fashion. In order to spell out the basics of Rancière's theory of aesthetics, let me take up a rather lengthy quotation from what I think is his best summary introduction to what he understands as the connection between art and politics. This comes from an interview. He says, quote, "I call the distribution of the sensible the system of self-evident facts of sense perception that simultaneously discloses, 1, the existence of something in common, and 2, the delimitations that define the respective parts and positions within it. The distribution of the sensible reveals who can have a share in what is common to the community based on what they do and on the time and space in which this activity is performed. There is thus an aesthetics at the core of politics, a system of a priori forms determining what presents itself to sense experience. Politics revolves around what is seen and what can be said about it, around who has the ability to see and the talent to speak, around the properties of spaces and the possibilities of time. It is on the basis of this primary aesthetics that it is possible to raise the question of aesthetic practices as I understand them. Artistic practices are ways of doing and making that intervene in the general distribution of ways of doing and making, as well as in the relationships they maintain to modes of being and forms of visibility." End quote. Rancière's approach to these questions is grounded in a careful analysis of what he calls the aesthetic revolution. You hear the word aesthetic a lot here. The rise at the end of this 18th century of the very idea of the aesthetic is what he has in mind, marked by a rupture with the representative norms in place from Aristotle until that point. The aesthetic, as Rancière articulates it, is that era in which it becomes possible to speak of art in the singular for the first time, not the arts. Something made possible, ironically, because the difference between art and non-art becomes effectively an indifference. For Rancière, then, art under the aesthetic regime has an unavoidably political character. That is, it is not simply that aesthetic art can be bound up with emancipatory politics, it is that aesthetic art is inevitably bound up with emancipatory politics. Indeed, for Rancière, it is no coincidence that the explorations of the workers' movements in Europe and the rise of the aesthetic regime of the arts took place side by side. But this connection between art and politics must not be misunderstood. It is not Rancière's claim that art with revolutionary content can stage effectively emancipatory political gestures. Indeed, in his writings, he often attempts to show how works that explicitly attempt to stage revolutionary questions, usually the films of Godard, end up working against themselves. Rather, Rancière's claim is that art as art is itself an emancipatory gesture, that its redistribution of the sensible is itself a political move. Why, though, for the moment, bring up both Rancière and Badiou? I think this question is especially important given my own basic tendency simply to agree with Badiou about most everything. But the reason that my own thinking about art has been in flux is because of a single essay by Rancière to be found in his book Aesthetics and Its Discontents, an essay that critiques Badiou's Handbook of Aesthetics. That essay alone, which I won't go into the details here, has convinced me that there is something very wrong about Badiou's thinking on art. Without getting into all the complexity staged by that essay, allow me just to say that I think it forces an essential question. Is Badiou right that art must be distinguished entirely from politics, separate truth procedures, except, of course, where it is considered philosophically in terms of compulsibility? Or is Rancière right that art cannot in any way be distinguished from politics, so that art has been for 2 centuries inherently revolutionary? It's a question that I myself don't yet have an answer for.
All right, let's...
Sorry, I got one more note to make now. Is it okay if I...
Yes.
Okay. I want to start with that now. It's funny because I would agree that, I guess with what I hear Rancière's sort of last word being, which is that art is necessarily connected to politics. Now I think that the question that I often have then is how art is connected to politics, because I think one of the questions that we often, not Joe and I, but I think that critical thinkers often come up against is whether art is essentially liberatory or whether art is essentially, I guess, regulatory in a sort of Althusserian way, like an ideological state apparatus. I'm inclined to think they work both ways, and that's probably where my opening remarks are going to lead for the next couple of minutes. I hope everyone's read 1984 by George Orwell, but I want to give you a sort of a take on it that's different than if you had to read it when you were a sophomore or junior in high school. I'm going to try to give you a different take on it. A lot of times we're taught that Orwell's novel is a sort of allegory for Soviet Russia or something like that. So it's an allegory for repressive state systems. This is either a tiny bit of what the novel is about, or it's entirely not what the novel is about, one or the other. My sense is that the story that Orwell tells in 1984 is about the end of imagination, and the ways in which, once we limit the capacity of language and ideas to represent new possibilities for how language and ideas can work, it's a very effective way of shutting down new possibilities. And I think that what Orwell's after, and you can see this in terms of a whole sort of modernist project when you talk about the 18th century, if we want to, is that what art does at the end of the day is allow us to imagine things differently than how they are, and it's that capacity of art that makes it political. Of course, because art is essentially the expression of imagination, is also very malleable. It's very open to being reworked or being absorbed by dominant culture or dominant ideology, and that, I think, was where the sort of precarity of art comes in, which is that its capacity for exploring new imaginative terrain is also its capacity for being absorbed and transformed as a sort of amplifier for dominant ideas. So we can talk about that some more as we go on. But certainly the relationship between art and revolution is a long-standing one. And if we look at the Western tradition, we can look at some pretty simple signal moments. I mean, Socrates would be one of the easiest places to go to, is that you present new ideas and you have people have conversations about those ideas, and that produces more new ideas. It doesn't produce truth, it produces more imagination and more conversations and more possibilities. Now, that Socratic tradition, in my view, is what leads to the Enlightenment, what leads to not only new political ideas like those coming out of France and Germany and England at the time, but also new art, and new art that becomes this sort of aesthetic amplifier for those new political ideas. So a couple of the authors I tend to turn to pretty often are Denis Diderot in France, certainly Voltaire in France as well, people who are thinking about how to arc politics with art. And that's certainly at the heart of the Enlightenment tradition, I think. When we move up and thinking about just seeing Matewan, one could argue, and I think that I'd be inclined to argue, that we wouldn't have the tradition of radical labor without a tradition of radical labor literature or radical labor art. So coming alongside of the workers' movement and the rise of anarchism and socialism in the United States, and obviously in Europe as well. But think about The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Think about The Octopus by Frank Norris, about the railroad industry in California. Think about Jack London, think about John Steinbeck, right? These are the voices that take what are at the time very marginal, very obscured political movements and make them available to the popular imagination. And then I think when we look at the break in France in the late 1960s, I might not see as much of a break between Frankfurt School and what comes after as Joe does, but I'd be inclined to look at a movement like situationism that really begins to think about how art can be used as a way of expressing new political ideas, and it's, in fact, from a situationist perspective, it's only through art that new political ideas can be explored. And especially for situationism, it's through art as guerrilla politics that politics becomes accessible to a larger cultural audience. Now, I feel like I'm already over time. That's the historical part. One of the things I'd be interested in talking about as we either debate or discuss is how these possibilities of art have become, I guess, changed. And I think that we talked about Lyotard about an hour ago at our lunch break. And one of the most influential philosophers for me is Jean-Francois Lyotard, who in the 1970s really began to anticipate the ways in which some new both social and commercial movements were able to harness the power of art and turn it into, well, for Lyotard, kitsch. Ways of taking what was possibly or what was formerly art that expressed revolutionary potential or art that expressed new ideas and make it into simple objects of consumption. So the two moments that we can think about this in most readily, I think, are one, in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the emergence of niche marketing. And for those of you who are old enough, you can think about the ways in which independent music became commodified in the late 1980s, early 1990s. So you can think about, well, all kinds of underground music scenes like house music, like rap, like punk rock, and even the sort of indie rock that's coming out of the Pacific Northwest at the time, although I'm a little more skeptical about that. But certainly it's niche marketing that makes it possible to have a sort of cosmetically diverse range of aesthetic products available to us, which create the illusion of difference and the illusion of competition, the illusion of different ideas working with and against each other. But they're all in the marketplace, of course, and that's how niche marketing is very effective at sustaining the illusion of choice and the illusion of freedom and all the other ideas that are attendant with that. But in fact, it's just a better working model of capitalism, or what Althusser would call an ideological state apparatus. I mean, Althusser, I think one of Althusser's great contributions to the philosophical tradition is that he realized that it's really not that effective when we live in societies that are governed by what he called repressive state apparatuses. That is, if you're bad, a cop comes and hits you over the head and takes you to jail. That's not very effective. I mean, as we see in May 1, right? I mean, what winds up happening when you have active repression like that is that you have blowback from the larger population. What works a lot more effectively is when you work with ideological state apparatuses that allow people to accept and, from a Foucauldian position, police themselves. It's far more effective, and it makes society work a lot more smoothly with a lot less noise and interruption. And one of the second social movement I would see as working against art's revolutionary potential would be the emergence of online social networking in the last decade. So you think about MySpace, Facebook, Twitter. One might even argue email. I'm really suspicious about how online social networkings work, and I think that it's really the next stage in a sort of, well, let me just tell you how I see it, and you can tell me if I'm wrong or not as we go on. That I think that just as niche marketing allowed us to say, go to the record store and you can buy, I gotta come up with an example now. Like let's say it's the earlier mid-90s or something, and one can buy a piece of schlock like a Young MC record, or one can buy something that is apparently different than that, like a Pearl Jam or Nirvana record. But at the end of the day, you're still going to the record store and you're making a purchase as though it was a larger act of political participation or something like that. With online social networking, what I'm starting to get concerned about is that we're now equating essentially watching TV with political participation, because I don't see whatever goes on in Twitter or Facebook or all this other stuff. I see it as essentially watching television. I think that computer screens are not windows to a larger world or democratic possibility. I think the computer screen is a mirror. The computer screen is really just an opportunity for us to interact narcissistically with ourselves. Anyway, that's something we can talk about more. Now, last comment, and then we can go on to a discussion. This is where I think Theodor Adorno and the Frankfurt School probably gets it wrong. They're right 99% of the time. But this is where I think they get it wrong, and Adorno especially. Adorno has this tendency of mistaking genre for content. So if you read Adorno's aesthetic work in the 1960s, he spends a lot of time talking about how popular music is the sort of the destroyer of imagination, the destroyer of creative possibility. And what you really need to do is go back to the classical music, like high art. And Adorno's not alone in making this claim. Well, I tend to not agree with that, because I think that as soon as we start mistaking genre for content, I think we make a profound mistake. And this is again where I think that later philosophers like Lyotard probably have a better claim on how this works. I think this is something that's going to go against, I think both Badiou and Rancière in this sense, is that what Lyotard calls for is a sort of reconceptualization of avant-gardism. That the mistake we often make is to misrecognize avant-gardism as a genre of art. So we look at the great French and Belgian artists of the 19-teens and 1930s. So we'll look at René Magritte, for instance, Marcel Duchamp, and so on. It was wonderful in its time, but it's certainly that the avant-garde has been certainly surpassed at this point. Well, Lyotard says no. Avant-gardism is a sensibility toward art, and it's one that always works in advance of a market or an ideology's ability to contain it and thus disable its revolutionary potential. And I think that what Lyotard calls for is actually, I think, something that's different than what you were saying about Badiou, which is a consciousness about how art only exists within a certain historical moment, and we can only understand its revolutionary potential in its historical moment and not mistake a particular genre or a particular move or a particular artist as always and inevitably, let's say, the acme of radical politics, or the on the other hand, the acme of crap consumerism. So that's what I tend to think about, when I go back to, well, all kinds of music, all kinds of art, all kinds of literature is, does it express what Leotard calls the experimental spirit, right? A will to think imaginatively about or beyond what we're given as a sort of constrained range of possibilities for, definitions of quality, definitions of value, definitions of beauty, and so on. So that's kind of where I want to end, is how can we sort of recognize and sustain the value of that avant-garde experimental spirit, regardless of genre, regardless of style and medium. So that's kind of where I wrap that.
Okay, well, I consider the panel's discussion as to whether or not they want to take questions from the audience or ask questions of one another. So,
point or two of clarification.
Okay.
And then we can go wherever. It's a point to. I think it's worth mentioning this, just a clarification really for everything. But Badiou defines art extremely narrowly. So when he says that there's no politically revolutionary potential in art, his point is to say that art, he's got an Adorno-like point here. He wants to say art is something much richer than any kind of commercializable art. He draws that distinction constantly. That's probably just worth getting on the table. As far as the point about the 1960s and 70s, what was happening there, when I say that those who were speaking out against the Frankfurt School, I think I actually agree with you. I'm speaking only about the people who continued to speak against the Frankfurt School. So that, for example, Badiou and Rancière both strongly disagree with Leotard on crucial points. So that, and they both seem to see that what happened, especially around 1976 or so, that there was this reaction against what had been going on. So, I agree that at first there's a lot of continuity between Frankfurt and what's going on in France, but after the 1970s, mid-1970s, it begins to become clear, I think, who has continuity with the Frankfurt School and who's breaking with it sharply. Those two just points of clarification, so we're on the same page. But we can go in whatever direction. I don't know if you want.
I wasn't really planning for a debate. I was hoping we could just sort of like lay some ideas out and have people ask questions or talk about it.
Questions? We can.
You mentioned that Badiou has a very narrow definition of art, and throughout this we've referenced art this and art that a lot without really having a working definition. Can I get a working definition from each of you of what you're referring to when you say art?
Can I give two answers?
Sure.
One for Badiou and one for Rancière. So for Badiou, art is a process in pursuit of artistic truths. For him, there are four kinds of truths: political truths, scientific truths, amorous truths, and artistic truths. And so for him, art is whatever is produced in the process of seeking artistic truths. That's really murky, and that's one of the reasons that Rancière has got me rethinking Badiou's conception of art. But for the most part, it's readily identifiable with most of the quote-unquote great art. Right? He seems kind of conservative in that regard. So far as Rancière goes, for him, art has gone through three periods, if you will. Three regimes is what he calls them. A sort of proto-regime up until Aristotle. And then Aristotle launches this, what he calls the representative regime of art, where art is always in some sort of imitative relationship with a set of norms or rules. And then that collapses with the dawn of the aesthetic regime of the arts, which begins for him as soon as people start using the word aesthetic at the end of the 18th century. And really comes into its own with the writings of Hegel, the German Romantics generally. And at that point, it's not clear what art is anymore, except that we can speak of art and not just there's painting and there's music, and so that we can speak of art as such. And but it's also the very period in which art and non-art become hard to distinguish. Now you can do things like Duchamp's work and that kind of thing. So for Rancière, he's looking very specifically at the kind of definition that's rising in the German Romantics.
I fear risking being even more murky than Badiou in this sense, but I think that, I'll try actually two examples. I'd like to say that art is simply the expression of imagination, and that the means or the modes of that expression is certainly available to us in the classic forms, dance, painting, music, literature, blah blah blah. But I think that it's also not limited to those. And I think, again, I mean, for me, the 18th century is really where we see that sort of radical experimentalism coming, at least coming into more easily visible forms. And again, I would turn to people like Diderot, people like Voltaire, where you've got very serious philosophers writing totally bizarre novels, right? And they're trying to figure out how can we use art to express these totally insane, totally countercultural ideas. And the great thing about 18th century art for me is they don't limit themselves to the sort of finer tradition. So if we look at Stern, if you look at Jean Paul in Germany, Voltaire's an easy example, Diderot's an easy example. Jonathan Swift, if you've ever read Gulliver's Travels, these guys turn to each and every form of expression they can come up with to sort of start getting political ideas and philosophical ideas out. And the great thing I like about these guys is they even turn to pornography. You know, all these books are totally pornographic, they're totally dirty, and they're thinking even the lowest form of art can be a vehicle for us to get at these higher truths. I also think that art is not limited to, and this is a classical Kantian idea, but I'm going to give you sort of a non-Kantian example. Art is also not limited to taste. And I think that one of the mistakes that many of us often make is, if I like it, it's good. If I don't like it, it must not be good. And I tend to think about it differently, that art far exceeds my capacity to like or dislike something. And one of a provocative comment that I heard from somebody who I profoundly dislike is G.G. Allin, the Detroit punk rock musician. And, you know, this is a guy who was notorious for crapping on stage and, you know, breaking bottles and stabbing people in the audience and stuff like that. It was, I don't have a whole lot of taste for this, right? It's not really where it's at for me. But something that he said really struck me is he said, well, you know, the way I look at it is, you know, my brain is like a machine gun, my body's the bullets, right? And what he was saying is, that's the way that I get ideas to people, right? So whether you like my art or not that important. But to see it as art, to see it as the expression of possible ideas, that part I can get on board with, right? So I think that anything that expresses possibility, anything that expresses imagination, must in some way be an artistic expression.
Good.
I've got to hand it back here.
We came in late, and you may have addressed this earlier. Comments from either of you about Walter Benjamin and the impact of technology on art?
I love Benjamin. I find Benjamin fascinating. I think Adorno's critique of that piece by Benjamin is poignant. But I don't know whether I'm speaking in the name of Badiou and Rancière or not here. But if I were speaking in the name of Badiou and Rancière, I don't know that I'd have anything to say. I've never seen them say much about Benjamin one way or the other. But I think Benjamin is very productive, but I think he needs to be read very carefully. I think Giorgio Gomman is a fantastic reader of Benjamin. But I do think Adorno does make a strong critique that does. And I suppose it took me a couple of seconds to figure out what I wanted to say. Rancière's got a book on film called Film Fables that I think is a nice step beyond Benjamin in light of Adorno's critique. That points out that film, the camera arts in general, are one and the same with the rest of the aesthetic regime of the arts. That film doesn't do anything different from what was already happening in Madame Bovary, what was already happening in Marcel Proust and these kinds of authors, because they've got the idea of a still, they've got the idea of establishing shot and so on, so that there's nothing inherently revolutionary about film as such, but that it's just parts of the production of the larger aesthetic regime. I hope that made sense.
Well, I think for me, one, I'm going to agree that I think that Benjamin is one of the many 20th century philosophers who's horribly misread, because he's one of the gang of people who many people will claim to understand but have never actually cracked a book, right? So I would put him in the same sort of category. Probably Adorno, Althusser, Foucault, Lyotard, Derrida. And not to say that there's one way to read these people, but I would rather people have read them and try work hard to make some sense out of very difficult material. Yeah. So I think, let me say that for all the difficulty, I think that the great contribution that Benjamin makes, and he's certainly not the first, but he may be the most important in the 20th century, that he really begins to break the barrier between high art and common art. Or even, and I think this is where the Arcades Project comes in, and it's not a book I have a whole lot of taste for, but again, have a lot of value for, is that what Benjamin is able to do as a serious philosopher is say, everyday life is worth evaluation, and everyday life in our sort of experiences with film or experiences with popular art or popular literature is worth analysis and worth evaluation. I think that's a profound contribution to philosophy.
What I was hoping to drag you to was this issue of the avant-garde and Benjamin's essay on the work of art, the age of mechanical reproduction and potential loss of spontaneity that technology may impose, which might influence or damage the idea of the avant-garde and people's capacity to find the spontaneous or the immediate when something is reproduced consistently. I don't know if that makes sense to you.
Well, okay, in the sense that I think that for Benjamin, perhaps with mechanical reproduction of artworks, like I can't remember what the sort of key example he uses in the essays. Let's just say you take the Mona Lisa, you put on a photocopier machine, you make a whole bunch of copies, and then I think that his point is we start getting distance from the craft, right, and the real aesthetic pleasure and experience. Sorry?
Yeah, the human connection.
Yeah. I might be inclined to agree because of a couple of metaphors I used earlier, which were, let's say, the reproduction of music through marketing or through online social networks. I think that the more we mistake, say, holding the photocopy of the Mona Lisa or tacking it up on the wall and sort of vulgarizing it in that way, as we have, virtual or digital communities or have virtual conversations, as we mistake buying a thing for making the thing, I think that we start to lose our will or lose the value of collective participation in the making of art, in the craft of art, which I think has to happen personally. It has to happen viscerally. So maybe for Benjamin, one might use the photocopy of the Mona Lisa as a way of saying, man, that's something I really want to see. I really want to have that human connection. So it initiates an idea, like I want to know more about this thing. The problem is when you take the facsimile and you say, that's where it's at, right? I've got enough right here. Am I doing okay with that? So I think that what's valuable about Benjamin is he raises questions that we need to then think about the stakes of, right? How can these technologies, whether they're film or think about what's going on in Benjamin's time, the sort of the record business, the film industry, easier mass production of literature and visual arts. All of these things create possibilities, and the question is, what do we do with them?
And particularly when you're talking about avant-garde, the avant-garde, it's designed in some way to shift consciousness, to shock, to move a culture's perception of itself. Mm-hmm. That becomes especially problematic, it seems to me. So.
If I may interject, my reading of Benjamin is what we were coming to here a moment ago, especially. As I read that essay in particular by Benjamin, what I see him saying is that the development of the mechanical apparatus in art, especially the camera arts, is a decisive moment in the history of art, because it opens up, on the one hand, the possibility of commodifying absolutely everything. But it also opens up the possibility that art can be stripped of its aura in such a way that we can finally recognize that things without auras have whatever aura art supposedly had at some other point, right? So that it becomes possible for us to recognize this piece of trash in a dump as part of a material history. That, I think, is a striking point he's making. So that it seems he's actually making a call for a certain relationship to the mechanical arts, to see in them a capacity to open ourselves to what may be genuinely significant in what usually is not regarded as significant in light of the camera arts. So, and in that regard, I think he is onto something, though I'm nervous about the language of aura in general coming back, which is one of the reasons I'm nervous about Leotard too, is constant talk of the other. But that's another story.
Can I say one more thing about that? Then I think that, yes, that what Benjamin may in a lot of ways allow or give us a language for it gives people a philosophical language for understanding avant-gardism when it really starts taking off in the 1920s, 1930s. But I think that what's important, if we look at let's take an easy example, which is Duchamp, right? And Duchamp takes these sort of ordinary household items or ordinary industrial items and says, this thing that you think is a use object or a piece of garbage or whatever may in fact also be this incredibly valuable aesthetic object. But the thing that Duchamp and I think other surrealists and avant-gardists of the time insisted on is that the experience of that difference had to take place in public, right? That it's still a collective experience. It's not one that you can, send me a fax of your snow shovel and say, oh, wow, this is going to blow my mind, and now I'm thinking that snow shovels are really this wonderful work of art. No, that for Duchamp, you have to put it in the public place where people expect to see something and then are confronted with the difference or the disjuncture between what they expected to see and what he's giving them. So, there I think that it maybe for Benjamin, what retains the aura, even if it's not the craft of Van Gogh painting this wonderful painting on canvas, but it's the public experience of wrestling with what you see in that public space. The aura then, sorry, one more thing. The aura then becomes, if I can rescue Benjamin for a moment, the aura then becomes a collective experience rather than the aura of individual genius.
This will be more directed for John. So we have this notion, right? You have countercultures who are expressing these radical ideas, developing these sort of communities that embody these ideas. Let's take the McLuhan notion of the medium being the message. Do you think it's the case that these counterculture sort of communities ever had a message to begin with? And then the fact that they're sort of ideologically going along with it, they think they're doing this sort of radical thing, but really what they're doing is not so much anything at all, right? They've sort of bought in a very sort of ironic way. They've bought in, or I guess I don't want to say bought in, right? The ideological state apparatus works within their framework too. Does that sort of that question make sense?
Well, let me see if I can bounce it back to you, because there's a bunch of stuff wrapped up in the question, I think. So let me see if I can take it in a couple ways, and you tell me if it works for you or not.
Sure.
The first one, I don't think countercultures begin with a project. I think countercultures develop projects collectively. So I think that one of the mistakes, one might, not you of course, Chris, but I think that one of the mistakes people may make is looking back at certain countercultural movements and say, oh, they must have been a failure because they didn't do X, Y, and Z. That doesn't make any sense to me, because in my view, it's the very existence of the will to counterculture that is its value. So a lot of times, I think that we're inclined to see failure because we don't see this massive payoff at the end of some kind of movement. Where, for me, what makes those movements valuable is that it's the potential in the moment to transform how people think about the world around them, about things like music and literature and stuff like that, but also transforming the ways in which people interact with each other. So when I think back on a couple of the moments or the social scenes that meant a lot to me, they didn't really have that much to do with genres of music or necessarily the longevity of those projects, but rather the transformative power those projects may have had, even if it was only for 5 minutes. Okay. Now, to take another part of the question, whether or not those countercultural movements wind up reproducing, am I okay? So reproducing the sort of logic of...
Well, there's sort of the notion, right? Punk rock, hardcore music, it's been commodified, it's now the mainstream. Right? There's that aspect where it gets desaturated from any sort of like content whatsoever. But my question is, was there content to begin with?
Yes, and again, this is where I say that the content I would say was palpable within the community, not necessarily with any representative band or any representative lyric or any representative genre or style. So again, it's mistaking the style and genre for the content, right? So I think that of course hardcore music or punk or whatever gets commodified because late capitalism has a profound absorptive capacity, right? To take movements or take genres and disable their countercultural or counter-normative or whatever you want to call it, potential. But to see that as a failing is to repeat the mistake, which is to say, oh, if that genre got absorbed, that must indicate a failure of hardcore, a failure of punk. No, what to me that does is it signals the need for hardcore or punk to rework itself, to refashion itself in such a way so that it can't, at least temporarily, be recognized by the commodification,
right.
The power of commodification.
So the very parts of the community itself that can be commodified. So at this point, you see a need to make a split where you have this sort of counterculture that shouldn't be based on art to begin with. Does that make sense?
No, it should totally be based on art. I think that
right.
art is what brings people together.
Okay, but do you think art is the most, like, it's sort of playing with fire at this point? Like, you're tossing on this hot coal, it's going to or burn you eventually. Well, okay, that's a bad analogy. What I want to say is,
okay.
Right, art itself is the very aspect of the counterculture that gets commodified.
No, I don't think so. I think that what winds up happening is that for me, art is, and this is a totally Kantian way of looking at it, so you can tell me you buy it or not, but what makes it art exceeds our capacity to talk about it. Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think that what makes marketing so insidious is that it reduces art to what can be talked about, right? It reduces art to a series of generic traits or like markers, like what kind of clothes do you wear or what kind of album art is there. It's like when you go to the video store or, you look at the DVD boxes, you can totally tell what kind of genre of movie it is by looking at the art style on the cover, right? It's like indie, is it, a Tyler Perry schlocky comedy? Right. So the same thing works with music, which is as soon as it becomes, this is my sense of it, right? As soon as it becomes something that you can, as soon as it's something that's accessible, as soon as it's something that you recognize and say, oh, I know what that is, for me, that's the moment when you know it's not art anymore. Mm-hmm. Okay, so my sense is art is going to exceed the capacity, as long as we still have that imaginative will or the experimental will, just to make my case for Leotard again, that's what allows art to continue to exceed the capacity for genreification or disabling. Mm-hmm. Okay, so look, let me give you an example. Okay, the last big concert I went to, I couldn't help but it was at was Energy Solutions up in Salt Lake.
How horrific!
And, well, right, it was horrifying, right? Because everybody who's there thinks they're there to see music. They think they're there to see a band. But the more I walked around, it's a shopping mall, right? It's a shopping mall that's disguised to be about music, because it's really all about selling cell phones and selling hot dogs and selling, you know, Guitar Hero video games and all this stuff. And like the music became so unimportant to the larger sort of carnival of consumption that was going on there. That's how you know, right? So I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I mean, again, that's the point when it's like, this is capitalism. This is not any sort of notion. I mean, that's the thing.
No, it's not capitalism. It's marketing. Okay, because I think that for bands to survive, it's almost unless you start in music or film or whatever, being so wealthy that you don't have to worry about consequences, you're always going to have to sell records. You're always going to have to go on tour. You're going to have to find somebody to watch your movie or buy your book. Okay, it's insane to think that some kind of, you know, money-art relationship is not going to be at work there. But to reduce it to marketing is the problem, right? To reduce what's otherwise, I think, a casual exchange to the heart of the exchange is the problem.
One quick outside word on this. It might be of interest to you, Chris, that for Badiou, since art is a question of truth, that means that there can't be any commodification without there having been truth first for Badiou. It's not that truth suddenly emerges out of the mix of all of these non-truth sorts of things. Truth comes first and everything else is a betrayal of it. So for him, commodification is a sign that something's happened, that something has gone on, and hence it's a kind of call. Anytime there is commodification or anytime anything like that goes on, it's a call back to. It's the sign that there's work here to do, which may be an interesting point.
No, I'll leave it at that.
Brett, did you hand up a while ago? Or I thought you. Greg, what do you want to say?
Yeah, actually, you made a claim. It's just somewhat esoteric discussion about theory, but I mean, what for example, is the actual revolutionary capacity of art? I mean, this may sound stupid, right? But they were singing Marseille, wasn't it Marseille, during the French Revolution?
In Haiti.
Yeah, well, in Haiti and also in Paris, right? I mean, this is one of the ways you have Brecht's, theater of the people. You have the Internationale, right? Sadly, not today, but the Internationale could have been recognized anywhere in any revolutionary struggle in the history of the world, except perhaps today in the United States and Western Europe. So, I mean, what concrete role does art play in actual revolutionary struggles, in actual revolutionary movements? And is it necessarily the case that as soon as you recognize it, which, I mean, again, for the majority, or much of the world, everyone would recognize the Internationale, but does that then degrade its artistic value, its artistic purpose? Is that also just marketing?
So for Badiou, he would say the reason he has such a narrow definition of art is precisely for this reason. Singing the Internationale would not, for him, be a question of art. It's a question of politics. It's part of the political process and so forth, but it's not art because it's not uncovering artistic truths. So he would just say, if we want to call that art, okay, we're talking sloppily, but that's fine and so forth. It's part of community, it's part of politics and so forth. But if we're going to talk about art qua art, then that's another thing entirely. So that it's not that there's something bound up within the Internationale that has some sort of revolutionary potential, right? Or even art as such for Badiou. It's just that's just a way of communicating, a way of it being together in political action.
Well, I think that it's the kind of music that cues other social rituals, right? I mean, I think that the Internationale is probably less a great work of art than it is, you know, the cue or the background of a larger social ritual.
And hence a question of politics, rather than art, so to speak.
Jack, right?
Yes. So would that mean that in a sense that it is art in its origination, in that, for instance, Duchamp's The Fountain, it's, you know, subverting, you know, the urinal, but then now, a few years ago, it was sold for a couple $1 million. So does it then become political in its commodified form? and change it. But I think for John's point, don't throw what Duchamp did out with the bathwater just because it was sold later on. Doesn't take away from what happened originally in its artistic form.
Well, that's kind of. I think that's what I was suggesting. I think that's what. If I'm reading Leotard right, I think that's what Leotard suggests is that the moment it gets sold for $2 million does not negate its power to challenge people and totally blow people's minds 70 years ago. And the problem is twofold, right? One is either to say that commodification negates its revolutionary power. The other piece of the problem is to say Duchamp is avant-gardism, right? And that to mistake avant-gardism for a genre, right? And say, oh, it's Magritte and Duchamp and this gang of fellas Man Ray and gang of guys in France in the 1910s and 1920s, right? So, but I also think that those like the selling of Fountain, for instance, becomes an easy shorthand for us to then go back and dismiss the value of these things. And I think that's the danger, is saying, oh well, as soon as you sold it, you must have sold out, right? And because I think that even for people who we can look back and say, well, you were kind of a sellout or whatever, that doesn't negate the spirit or the experimental capacity that person had to come up with an idea and to make that idea communicate its power to other people as well.
Again, I think this is maybe why Badiou's notion of art may be really productive. The idea that any commodification is always grounded in an actual work of art in the first place.
But I mean, if I can interject here, right? It seems to me though that's the actual split though, right? You divorce the message from the medium, and you just take the medium, and that's what becomes the commodity, right? Does that seem?
Does it then lose its message though, or can the medium still contain the message once commodified?
Well, I mean, you can play loud, angry, aggressive music, but it doesn't mean it's talking about revolutionary politics or any variety, right?
But even if it is, it's not going to register.
Uh-huh.
That's what's so insidious about marketing,
yeah.
right? Is that you can actually hear that message all day, every day, but it's not going to actually affect people. It's not going to change the way people think about things.
Why?
Because it's something that they're simply consuming, right? It's not something that. Well, and this is where I'm going to make my grand claim for why punk rock in the 1980s was so important, which is it had a little to do with the message, the content of the music, like the lyrical content or whatever. It was more about the social space that was being developed through the music when people came together around the music. So that is, some knucklehead sitting at home, you can listen to quasi-political music all day, but as long as you see that as something that I'm just going to buy, I'm going to put in my iPod and rock out, for a couple hours, and I'm going to go do something else, that's not going to have a whole lot of power. But what happens when you have that same experience in a room full of people, it changes, it intensifies the value of that content. It makes that content meaningful.
If I can try and just restate that to see if I'm getting the right sort of perspective. You mentioned the Socratic dialectic as kind of being the origin of communal imagination, as it were.
Not the origin, but this is an easy example
right.
to get started.
So what you're saying is that basically, pre-commodification, these mediums of art are kind of in a dialectic with their culture.
Yes.
And post-commodification, they are dialectic with commodification, and thus no longer productive toward the revolutionary.
I think that's well said, right? So one commodity exists in a society of other commodities rather than music existing in a culture of other people, right? So I think that's, if I follow you, I think that'd be a really cool way of looking at it. And that's why I looked at the concert I went to at the Delta Center, where it was like a shopping mall, right? It wasn't about going to see music, it was about shopping.
Let's stipulate for the moment that there is revolutionary potential in art. How would one remain faithful to the sort of revolutionary potential in art rather than just this endless generation of simulacra and things like this?
Can I take that one?
Yeah, it's for both of you. I know it would be good.
This is something I was actually thinking about a lot over the last couple days. And I think that the easiest way I could say how you know which side of the line you're on, as an artist or as a musician or as an intellectual, right? Because you can see the same problem at work in the academic world as well. Are you going to make decisions based on increasing or either maintaining or increasing your currency, or are you going to make decisions based on, pursuing your own intellectual or artistic passions? And that's where I know that the line is that way too many people make decisions based on what's going to get them more currency, what's going to get them more recognition. And you can see that in the way that people decide not only what kinds of aesthetic or philosophical or whatever works to produce, but also who they associate themselves with, right? Like, who do they shun? Who do they, who do they deign to engage with? So I think that for me, the way you know the answer to that question is, how do you make the decisions that you make? And it has nothing to do with what your music sounds like or what kind of philosophical school you align yourself with. I think those things are all totally cosmetic.
So do you think there's anybody in Hollywood, like a director or writer, that you think exemplifies that sort of sticking to?
In Hollywood?
I don't know.
No, that's a serious question.
Like, no. I mean, I know, but it's like I ask it out of ignorance.
No, I don't know enough about what's going on to know the answer to that question.
Because it seems like some actors, and I don't know, maybe this is, maybe it means nothing, but it seems like some actors are like, okay, I'll do a serious film, not serious film, and then there's people that like kind of make it, and then after that, they do all indie films afterwards. And like, what are your thoughts on that? Garbage.
I think that I'm not sure if I think the distinction is credible.
Okay.
I don't think there are independent films, or at least indie film is like punk rock, right? It's a generic term that actually empties out actual independence, right, from filmmaking, right? So I think that's the nonsense where people think they go to Sundance, they think they're seeing something different, right? Where again, Sundance. This is the first time I went to Sundance was this year. Again, it was a shopping mall, right? It was a shopping mall for movies, right? But all these things are saying, well, because we're doing it at Sundance, it's indie, right? And indie is just a name for a new genre of mainstream films. So, but that's about as much as I know. And so when you say, do I know something in Hollywood? Do I know actors? I don't think so, because I think that as soon as an actor even gets in that circle, the only reason they got there was because they've been working in the pursuit of currency.
So, to take a Rancierian approach to the question, how do we maintain the revolutionary capacity of art? Rancière would just say, it's very simple. Is what you're creating an attempt to speak, and to speak universally, without what distinctions, I suppose. And Rancière would say, as long as that's happening, what you're doing is aesthetic art, and as long as it's aesthetic art, it is part of this emancipatory political. Inevitably, it's part of emancipatory politics, because it's an attempt to rearrange the public space in such a way that allows humanity as such to emerge, and that may be because of the other conceptions of art, Badiou's conception, for example. Right? It becomes difficult to think about it in those terms when one's involved in art in one way or another, because one is trying to produce something great or something true or something better. But for Rancière, it's merely a question of staging universality as such, and that may be the best approach. I don't know.
Well, in that sense, I think it'd be very consistent with the Socratic tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Does that mean then that sort of films that have more anti-humanist aspects are more universalizable and more concerned with arts, or?
Do you have an example in mind? Or?
Well, I don't know. Arts where it seems like persons, it doesn't focus on like their interpersonal experience and things like this, but rather their role, and there's sort of a generic name, things like this.
Perhaps, but universalizable here would just mean not ordained for one part of society as such, one that breaks with particulars in that sense. So it's not that, and in fact, both Rancière and Badiou are committed to the idea that the singular is genuinely universal. particular that's not. There's this gap between singularity and particularity. So I don't know that it would have to be somehow, generic in that sense. But that it would have to be. I mean, a classic example from the region here would be Napoleon Dynamite, right? Which in some sense spoke to very easily commodifiable, right? No question. And yet it was a film that is wildly generic, even though it's a very particular person. And it's that kind of thing, perhaps, that Rancière has in mind.
Yeah, and one of the other examples that just came to my mind was, thinking about, one of the stories that Americans love to tell themselves is stories about the Holocaust, right? It's tragic, and we get to sort of portray ourselves as being the heroes, and so on and so on. And I think it was actually the American Indian author Sherman Alexie made this point, and certainly not the first person to make the point, but one could argue, at least since Night and Fog from 1954, the most accurate film about the Holocaust is Life is Beautiful. Why? Because it's a Holocaust comedy. It totally forces you out of the framework, the sort of grand, global, tragic framework that the Holocaust tends to get sort of thrown into, and it forces you to rethink how you understand it. And it's certainly a story about particularity, because in some ways it participates in other great generic tropes, like the father-son, bonding movie. But to restage it in that scene and to take two generic conventions that are apparently incompatible with each other and put them together like that, that changes the way that people think. Not only about the event itself, but also the medium, right? How is the medium being used to present a new idea?
Like a Beckett novel, right?
Totally, yeah.
I mean, it's just like a Beckett novel.
Well, and like I was saying about the way that 18th century philosophical writers turned to comedy, turned to pornography, turned to scatology as a way of thinking philosophically, right? You can see the same, or at least let's say a similar impulse at work in a Holocaust comedy, for instance.
Now, if only Leotard could have seen that.
Let's take 5-minute little wrapping ups between the two of you, and then we'll move on to Will's second.
I don't know. I'm okay. I'm actually okay.
Are you guys good?
Yeah.
Question?
I'd rather take one more question. If it's
Yeah,
okay with you,
yeah,
Joe,
that's fine with me.
We'll take one question.
I'll see if I can sound like any answering your questions.
Let's go back to your criticism of social networking. Now, you said both that the Socratic dialectic kind of forms it's one of these great examples of how we create the collective imagination of a people. For me, certainly the internet and social networking included has become a way of increasing the accessibility to information as well as communication. Now, you mentioned the issue with the creation of facsimiles as a replacement to the actual, but is there anything in the nature of these social networks that are on the internet that deprives them of the ability of participating in a Socratic dialectic?
Boosh.
Wait, I'm sorry. Is there anything inherent in the medium itself?
In the medium itself, or is it just the way people choose to use it?
Or can I add, is it on the commodification of social networking sites? I mean, because the function of social networking site like Facebook or MySpace, I mean, like a guitar or like camera is used as kind of, I think, John, you put it as a artistic amplifier for your so-called revolutionary ideas. So, yeah, to rephrase, is it in the commodification or is it in the use? Or and that's for both of you, not just John.
Yeah, well, it seems to me that in Lacanian terms, Facebook is the new big other. I mean, it's that simple, isn't it? Right? And it gives us a space to relate to the other, and whether our same old neurotic ways or so. I don't know that there's anything inherent in the medium itself. It's just the new big other, and so there may be revolutionary relationships we can take up with relation to that, like we would with any other big other, or whether we just play out our silly neuroses before the computer instead of before our girlfriend or whatever.
Joe, I'm sorry to interrupt. Can you explain the other for
The
those
big other is just
myself included? I don't know.
the entire symbolic universe, right? The rules, the way things are as such,
Okay.
and all of that, society as such, if you will, which stands in relation to the individual psyche, for the right? So your position, if you will, as a subject, which of course is an emptiness, but your position as a person, if you will, is your position with respect to the big other. So the Facebook just takes the place of any other big other we had before, and we're just playing out our same neuroses.
Awesome.
In a new context.
And actually, let me take a page from Baudrillard to answer this question, because in the 1980s, the French philosopher Jean Baudrillard started to recognize the ways in which, for him, I mean, Americans were the sort of acme of this, but not the only, not unique in this sense. But we're beginning to sort of simulate social interaction. And one of the points that he made was that interface starts replacing communication. So, we communicate in these sort of we communicate in memes. In other words, that think about the catchphrase you heard last night on TV or something, and the next day you're going to hear 100 people say that same dumb phrase, and it's an empty phrase, and it's a phrase that some writer came up with as a gimmick, right? I mean, that there is no original content to this; it is pure marketing, right? But we say it to each other all the time as though it was meaningful. So what? I'm building an analogy or a metaphor here. So I think that online social networkings work the same way. What we do is we share memes, and we share catchphrases, and we share avatars with each other, but we don't share ourselves with each other. And I think that kind of deeper interaction or deeper social relationships can only happen in person. I mean, I think it's why I love the job I have, right? Is that I get to go to work every day and hang out with 20 people and talk about ideas together, right? And that doesn't happen when you're on the computer. And I think that you used a perfect word, which is what we trade on the computer or what we trade online is information. And information isn't where it's at, okay? Information doesn't have any content. And this, I'm just, putting my leotard hat on again, which is information has no value at all until it becomes invested with some kind of context or some kind of purpose. So I think that's the problem, is that we see, not you or not I necessarily, but generally, we say, oh, look, I can go on Wikipedia and I can exchange all this information with all these people. But that's all you're doing, right? Is that there's this sort of endless stream of data that takes the place of content.
So do you believe that the face-to-face is necessary in order to have real interaction, that basically nothing but that environment can create real human connection?
I do, and that's why I suggested that when we're on the internet, we're not actually talking to each other. The internet is a mirror. The internet is not a portal to a bigger universe. Okay, the computer screen is a mirror. And I could probably make some kind of Graham Lacanian argument about that. But what it is this sort of, it's this very fantastical, but nonetheless really infantile, narcissistic relationship that we have with ourselves. But we get to imagine that we're having this. It's the acme of grandiosity. It's the acme of a narcissistic personality disorder if you spend a lot of time on the internet. Because you have this imagination that you're out there and everyone's listening to you and look at this big presence I have, in the world. But at the end of the day, you're just watching internet porn and jerking off, right? It's a simple metaphor, but I think that it's an accurate one.
To add just one last thought onto that,
Not that you have to buy that last metaphor or anything.
Yeah, no, I think it's appropriate metaphor, actually. Lacan would be happy with it.
Well, that's why I signaled that I'm going a Lacanian direction at this point.
I think that's right. The one thing I'd quibble on, and this is, I mean, if we wanted to have a debate, it's too late in the day to have it. But I don't think that means that we've got to leave it in order to go to face to face. I think that the face to face may just be another mirror.
It could be, yeah.
And that's where Leotard and I part ways. He's too Lebanesian in that regard. It's the face of the other, and we end up trapped in what I think is really just a kind of decomposed traditional theism. But that's a story for another day, perhaps.
Let's give him a hand.
Okay.